Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me in this rather uncommon format of presentation. I was due to give you a talk in Eastwood on the 10th of June, but obviously I couldn't make the trip from France to Britain to see you, and so I've decided to record what would have been the first part of my presentation, hoping that I may see you next year to deliver the rest of my talk in Eastwood. So I will be talking to you about D.H. Lawrence and Thomas Hardy. Many literary critics before me have spoken and written about the numerous similarities between D.H. Lawrence's and Thomas Hardy's novelistic themes. Now, Lawrence himself admiringly acknowledged Hardy's significance to modern English literature and to the shaping of his own artistic expression. Now, he said in a letter, for instance, here's the quotation, "They are all, Turgenev, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Maupassant, Flaubert, so very obvious and coarse, beside the lovely, mature and sensitive art of Fenimore Cooper or Hardy." Unquote. I have often wondered why two novelists and poets who appeared to share a multitude of opinions, acquaintances, and interests should not have been personally close or even simply have met in the course of their lifetimes. Now, Hardy was certainly aware of Lawrence's existence among the talented young writers of his time, if only because Lawrence was one of the 43 poets who contributed to a compilation of Hardy's poems presented to Hardy as a poet's tribute in October 1919, for which Hardy is said to have written a letter of thanks to each of the contributors, including Lawrence. Now, while we may find surprising that neither Lawrence nor Hardy seems to have sought to make the other's acquaintance, I have found no trace in either of the two correspondences any sign of such a possibility. Now, we should keep in mind that despite their creative proximity, Lawrence and Hardy belonged in life to separate generations as well as separate social, literary, and even geographical circles. Thomas Hardy was born in Dorset in 1840, so that's 45 years before D.H. Lawrence, and he died in January 1928, which, remember, was the year Lady Chatterley's Lover was first published, and only 2 years before Lawrence's death. So when Lawrence first read Hardy's novels as a youth, the older writer's reputation was already firmly established, and his novelistic career was essentially at an end after the publication of his last major work of fiction in 1895, and that was Jude the Obscure. It is still puzzling, however, that when Lawrence embarked on his rereading of Thomas Hardy's complete works in July and August 1914 with the objective of writing a book on Thomas Hardy, which was first published as 6 novels of Thomas Hardy and the Real Tragedy, which was later to become chapter 3 of what we now know as Study of Thomas Hardy, Lawrence did not try to discuss his interpretation of Hardy's expression of tragedy with the author himself. The first ideas I would like to discuss with you are similarities in the two authors' families social backgrounds, early lives, and personalities. Lawrence and Hardy grew up in rather similar circumstances, which likely explains some of the correlations between their works, and yet the accounts of their lives as they are presented in the various biographies that I consulted give a definite sense of largely opposite personalities. Now, the excellent biographies I consulted, for those of you who might like to read more about Lawrence and Thomas Hardy's lives, are, first of all, Edward Nail's D.H. Lawrence A Composite Biography, and Harry Moore's The Priest of Love for Lawrence, and then for Hardy, Michael Milgate's Thomas Hardy, and the partially autobiographical work entitled The Life and Work of Thomas Hardy, which, interestingly, was predominantly written by Hardy himself before being edited and published after his death by his second wife, Florence. Hardy was the first-born child of 4 siblings, and like Lawrence with his sister Ada, Hardy was always closest to the sister who was nearest to him in years, and that's Mary. Although he was also fond of his younger brother Henry and his youngest sister Kate. The four Hardy children spent more time together throughout their lives than Lawrence did with his own siblings. This, of course, is partly due to the fact that the Hardy children never strayed very far from their cottage in the native village of Higher Bockhampton, while Lawrence's visits to his family in the Midlands grew scarcer. Michael Milgate, Hardy's biographer, underlines the powerful clan feeling which Hardy's mother succeeded in creating between her 4 children, and the gravitational pull that she herself exercised on them. So I would now like to focus on a mother's influence in the lives of Thomas Hardy and D.H. Lawrence. Jemima Hardy, who was Jemima Hand originally, displayed the same determination as Lydia Lawrence to raise her children, and especially her eldest, Thomas, above her own social and economic condition, to spare them the extreme poverty that she had known in her childhood. Michael Milgate observes, and here I quote, that Jemima's ambitions for her eldest son, and for herself through her son, strikingly resemble Mrs. Morell's for Paul in Sons and Lovers, and the other kinds of tension so powerfully dramatized in Lawrence's novel had their milder counterparts within the Hardy household. Unquote. In Hardy's own work, his relationship with his ambitious and overbearing mother infuses the tragic bond of life and conflict between Clym Yeobright and his mother in the novel The Return of the Native. Here's a quotation from that novel. The love between the young man and his mother was strangely invisible now. Of love it may be said, the less earthly, the less demonstrative. In its absolutely indestructible form, it reaches a profundity in which all exhibition of itself is painful. It was so with these. Had conversations between them been overheard, people would have said, "How cold they are to each other." His theory and his wishes about devoting his future to teaching had made an impression on Mrs. Yeobright. Indeed, how could it be otherwise when he was a part of her, when their discourses were as if carried on between the right and the left hands of the same body? Unquote. Like Clym Yeobright in the novel, Hardy's choice of wife and perilous change of career were disapproved by his mother and put a strain on their relations. But unlike his fictional character, Hardy never broke with his mother, choosing instead to settle close to the cottage of his childhood, where he frequently visited his parents until their deaths. Interestingly, in his letters and conversations, Hardy always considered that cottage as belonging to his mother rather than to his father, and his account of his parents in the life of Thomas Hardy establishes his mother as being the head of the household. Thomas Hardy Sr., our author's father, was a stonemason and a smallholder, so that in spite of the poverty the family lived in when Hardy was a child, they never suffered from a lack of food or of comfort. They had a fruitful garden, and Hardy's parents kept frugal country habits, which Hardy actually kept throughout his life, even at a time when he was relatively affluent as a writer. Hardy's prose and poetry owe much to his mother, not only because her ambition for him ensured him a good education, but because a large part of Hardy's material and his impressions, as he called them, was fueled by the many tales and anecdotes that his mother was fond of telling, and also by the inherent pessimism and the fear of disaster held by rural folk, which she instilled in him. The relatively happy and harmonious family life that Hardy describes sadly contrasts, of course, with the picture we have of the Lawrence household. Lydia Lawrence had much the same kind of maternal hold as Jemima over her eldest son, Ernest, until his early death, when she then transferred her oppressive love onto her youngest son and revived her ambition towards the education of Bert Lawrence, determined as she was to keep him out of the mines, as she had been with Ernest Lawrence.